Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, brought to you by the Sci-Fi-Christian.com. I am Bendy Bono. It's been a while since we've done one of these, everyone. You know, we've been doing the Game of Thrones stuff, had a beer review of the Game of Thrones beer. Speaking of which, if you are a book review listener only, you probably aren't aware yet that I've launched a new YouTube channel, the Bendy Bono Beer Show. So go check that out. It's awesome. You'll love it. If you love beer. If you don't like beer, you probably aren't going to be too interested. But anyway, I'd appreciate it if you check it out anyway. But yeah, we're back with the book reviews. Talking today about Kim Stanley Robinson's sci-fi novel Red Mars, the first in the Mars trilogy. This is a book I read a long time ago. When I was a teenager. I've talked before on these book reviews about how, when I was a teenager, my criteria for a good book is that I wanted, a good sci-fi book is I wanted aliens and explosions and, the typical dumb stuff. So of course I didn't like this novel that much then. But I had a hunch that I would enjoy it more if I revisited it now, and I was right. This is actually a really good book. It is a science fiction novel in the purest sense of the term. We tend to throw around the word science fiction pretty loosely these days. We're certainly guilty of that, intentionally so, at the Sci-Fi Christian, where we use it as a shorthand for fantasy and horror and superheroes and anything else. But no, this is a science fiction book in the vein of Arthur C. Clarke and Michael Crichton and other authors like that who are actually interested in exploring scientific concepts. In this case, it's far more than just futuristic technology or speculative fiction of what it would be like for humans to colonize Mars. But there's also elements of political theory and sociology and psychology in here. So it really is science in terms of the full gamut of scientific theory. So yeah, the book is about, if you're not familiar with it, it's exactly what I just said. It is a exploration of what it would be like to colonize Mars. So we follow the first 100 humans in there who are on this first journey to Mars. Or I guess before the novel opens, there have been an expedition or two to Mars, but this is the first permanent colony there. And we see how they develop in terms of different philosophies about what ought to be done with Mars. People have different agendas in terms of, should we terraform it, should we leave it as is. Different factions begin to form, and we get this whole political, sociological, and scientific, in more of a physics biology sense, exploration of what would it be like to colonize Mars. In many ways, this book is a 500-page thought experiment on that. It's very fascinating, really, really fascinating stuff if you're into that. It's a really, really good book. It's interesting because in some ways, and this may seem unlikely until you hear my explanation, but in some ways it really reminds me of George R. R. Martin's work in Song of Ice and Fire. Partially because, just like Martin does in the novels, and this isn't going to make sense if you've only seen Game of Thrones, the TV show, but what Martin does in the novels is every chapter is written from a different character's point of view. Robinson does something similar. It's not quite every chapter. He tends to stick with a particular character for much longer than Martin does, over several chapters in a row, but he'll do that same sort of thing where you kind of have this shifting perspective throughout the novel. And then the whole sense of shifting allegiances and complex politics and people backstabbing one another, and really the whole political, sociological stuff from George R. R. Martin's work is very much at play here too. So if there's any, this would actually make brilliant fodder for any networks looking to develop their own kind of Game of Thrones. I could see, there's 3 books in the trilogy, but man, you could easily turn this first one into 2 to 3 TV seasons, because the scope is that big. It takes place over several years. And there's enough material, enough gaps in the narrative where you could really dive into some stuff that Robinson just doesn't have time to get into in the books. So you can tell I'm pretty positive on the book. I'm going to give it 4 stars, and let me get into why it's not a 5. Partially because I just compared it to Song of Ice and Fire, George R. R. Martin's work, and Martin has something that Robinson doesn't, which is a real skill for managing these complex array of characters at a plot level. And that's not to say this is a poorly written book, but especially if you can compare the two in terms of how they are structurally similar and the writing style is similar, it's just no contest that Martin is a great writer, whereas Robinson is a great thinker who is an adequate writer. You know, he is not a great novelist. That's not to say he's a bad novelist. I want to be very careful there. He isn't. But he's not a great novelist. And there's some points in this book where that really comes through. In the opening chapters of the book, and I'm not going to get into specifics here, but it happens right away in the book. A main character dies. So the book these opening chapters take place in the middle of the timeline of the book, and then we flash back and begin the story going forward. So this main character dies in the opening of the book, and we recognize that it's supposed to be a major event. And then when we actually catch up to that much later on in the book, in the actual timeline, it's passed over so quickly and with so little detail that we're kind of left wondering, why was this thrown out there? Why was this something we're supposed to be thinking about and looking forward to and anticipating, when Robinson really rushes over it when he actually gets there? And that's just one example, but you see some things like that. And because of that, some of the scientific stuff and some of what Robinson's trying to explore thematically gets lost in the process, because he's not deft enough at handling the complexity that a novel like this demands. But again, that's not a fatal mistake. It's still a really good book. You certainly can still follow it. I don't want to paint it as though he just botches it by any means. It's just obvious that he's a better thinker than he is a writer, that's all. And quite frankly, there's a lot of people who are decent at putting together a novel, but their ideas suck, and I'd much rather have a book like this. So obviously it's best when you have both. But this is still a good book. It's still very much worth your time. I would absolutely recommend it to fans of Game of Thrones who are looking for something kind of in that similar vein of complex politics and a vast array of characters and all that. There's no dragons, so don't go in with that expectation. But it's if you're looking for a solid science fiction novel that's going to keep you thinking, you can't go wrong with Red Mars. I just started listening to the sequel, which I'd never read before, so Green Mars is the next one. So I will come back with that review whenever I finish it. But for now, Red Mars, King Stanley Robinson, I'm giving it 4 stars, and I recommend you check it out. So that's all for now. This is the Bendy Bono, what am I calling this? The Sci-Fi Christian book reviews, not the Bendy Bono book reviews. See, it's been too long, everyone, but it's good to be back. Sci-Fi Christian book reviews. Goodbye.